one inmate inside this prison bought forensic suits and goggles before carrying out a double murder so horrific that police officers were later offered counselling after discovering the scene. Another spent years stealing from a retired teacher before luring him to a flat through a fake dating profile and hiding his body under a bed. And another was one of Britain's most notorious serial killers, a man linked to multiple murders spanning more than a decade. This is HMP Edinburgh, also known as HMP Saughton. Located in Edinburgh, this prison has housed murderers, rapists, serial killers, and some of Scotland's most dangerous offenders. But unlike prisons such as Belmarsh or Wakefield, it isn't as easy to determine exactly who is currently being held here. Because of that, the inmates featured in this video are those known to have passed through these walls, whether to serve a sentence or while awaiting trial. Let's explore just some of the inmates linked to HMP Edinburgh. This first inmate filmed TikTok videos, laughing and dancing with his fiancée, just days before a stranger was found dead in their flat. And what police later found on his phone would help reveal exactly what happened that night. This is the case of Dylan Brister. On the 3rd of November 2021, emergency services were called to a flat on Heriot Crescent in MacLeod in Fife. Inside, they found the body of 24-year-old Callum Simpson. Callum was a dad of 4, and his youngest child was just 11 days old. His family later spoke of the milestones he would never see and the memories that his children would never get to share with their dad. His partner described the agony of losing her childhood sweetheart, saying the young family missed him desperately. Just days before Callum's death, Dylan Brister and his former fiancée, Cameron Allen, had been posting TikTok videos together, dancing and joking around. The night before, on the 2nd of November, Dylan and Cameron had been using Grindr, looking for someone to join them for a threesome. Messages shown in court revealed they discussed tying a man up and using him sexually. One man initially seemed interested, but he backed out when drugs were mentioned. During sentencing, the judge would later remark that his narrow escape became Callum Simpson's misfortune.
I won't do this. I'm on TikTok, so be careful what you're saying. You go look.
I'm the same.
Your eyes look red.
That same evening, Dylan invited his friend Dylan Stewart to his flat for what messages described as a quiet night in. Stewart was already with Callum Simpson at the time, so Callum also came along. Neither of these two men knew about the messages that had been exchanged earlier that day. It's believed that not long after arriving, Callum's drink was spiked. And later that night, Dylan Stewart left the flat, leaving Callum alone with Dylan Brister and Cameron. For a while, only Dylan and Cameron knew exactly what had happened inside that flat. But police would later recover a deleted video from Dylan's phone that told a very different story to the accounts that they told police. Callum was rendered unconscious, his wrists were tied with rope, and he was sexually assaulted while unable to respond. Afterwards, the couple simply went to bed. When they woke the next morning, Callum was cold and stiff to touch. A post-mortem later found that he had died from intoxication caused by a combination of alcohol and the Class C drug atizolam, often known as street Valium, a powerful sedative. As the investigation got underway, Dylan claimed that Callum had consented to what had happened, but police had already recovered the deleted video, recorded at around 2:45 that morning. The footage showed that Callum was unconscious throughout the assault, completely ruling out Dylan's version of events. At trial, both Dylan and Cameron turned on each other. Dylan claimed that Cameron admitted putting tablets in Callum's drink, while Cameron denied responsibility. Prosecutors argued that it didn't matter who had physically administered the drugs. The evidence showed that they were acting together and they were both fully aware of the risks involved. The court also heard that Dylan had previous convictions for predatory behaviour involving the spiking of 2 women. A tablet was placed in one woman's drink, while he placed another tablet directly into another woman's mouth without her consent. In the end, both Dylan Brister and Cameron Allen were convicted of the rape and murder of Callum Simpson. Both men were placed on the sex offenders register indefinitely. The judge described their actions as displaying a wicked recklessness that amounted to murder. Cameron Allen was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years, while Dylan Brister received life with a minimum term of 23 years. But as investigators dug deeper into Dylan's past, they uncovered another disturbing crime that had taken place just 2 weeks before Callum's murder. A woman named Becky Young had initially become friends with Dylan after meeting him at a party. However, she later described his behaviour as increasingly possessive and unpredictable. Eventually, she decided to cut contact, but Dylan didn't take it very well. On the 23rd of October 2021, just 11 days before Callum's death, Dylan broke in to Becky's flat. Once inside, he removed his jacket, set fire to it in her bedroom, and left the property to burn. Becky wasn't home that night, but her 2 cats were. Before leaving, Dylan had trapped them in the bathroom. Both cats died from smoke inhalation as the fire tore through the property, causing around £100,000 worth of damage. When this case came before the courts in 2026, the judge described Dylan as a very dangerous man. He received an additional 32-month sentence to run consecutively to his current life sentence. This next inmate bought forensic suits, goggles and plastic overshoes before carrying out a double murder so horrific that police officers were later offered counselling after discovering the scene. This is the case of Ian MacLeod. Weeks before the crime, 66-year-old Ian MacLeod and his 42-year-old son Dean had been purchasing unusual items. Among them were blue plastic overshoes, white forensic suits, and protective goggles. At the time, they maybe appeared to be innocent purchases, but investigators would later conclude that they were anything but. Their first victim was 37-year-old Derek Johnston. Derek already knew Ian MacLeod and had reportedly become increasingly fearful of him. According to evidence heard in court, Derek had even told a neighbour that the MacLeods were out to kill him. The pair also held significant financial control over him, making Derek particularly vulnerable. On the 30th of October 2022, Derek was invited to Ian's flat on Greendykes Road in Edinburgh. What awaited him inside was something that few could have imagined. Prosecutors said that Derek was met by Ian and Dean, dressed head to toe in forensic suits. Derek was then subjected to a prolonged and brutal attack. Armed with weapons including a hammer, machetes and a Stanley knife, the pair inflicted catastrophic injuries before mutilating his body. The court heard that the attack was not only violent but deeply sadistic. Evidence later revealed that the letters YLT had been burned into Derek's forehead using a blowtorch, a reference to the Young Leith Team, a street gang that Ian had once associated with. He was also found with nails through both of his eyes and a hammer protruding from his head. When the attack was finally over, the MacLeods took steps to prolong their crime. Concerned that Derek's dog might attract attention through barking or distress at his absence, they reportedly went to his home and removed the animal. Then, just 1 day later, they struck again. Their second victim was 66-year-old Desmond Rawlings, a retired joiner who lived in the same building complex. Because Desmond knew Ian as a neighbour, there was no reason for him to suspect any danger. Like Derek, he was invited to the flat, and like Derek, he also never returned home. The attack followed a chillingly similar pattern. Desmond was ambushed, subjected to extreme violence, and mutilated before the same letters were burned into his body. The following day, on the 1st of November 2022, concern began to grow. It was Desmond's 67th birthday, and his partner had attempted to call him to wish him a happy birthday. But there was no answer. When she visited his flat, she found that the lights were still on, the TV was still playing, and his car was parked outside. But Desmond was nowhere to be found. That same evening, police forced entry into Ian MacLeod's flat, and what they found inside shocked even experienced officers. The walls and ceilings were heavily bloodstained, indicating an attack of extraordinary violence. Derek Johnston's body was discovered in the bath beneath a rug, while Desmond Rawlings' body was found in the living room covered by a blanket. The scene was so disturbing that officers who attended were later offered counselling because of what they had witnessed. Post-mortem examinations later revealed the true extent of the violence. Derek had suffered 28 separate injuries, and Desmond had suffered 136. Evidence suggested that both men may have remained alive for hours after suffering their initial head injuries. Investigators also discovered a handwritten note in the hallway. It read, "What we'd done was evil and sadistic." But by that point, Ian and Dean MacLeod were no longer there. After the murders, the pair had attempted to take their own lives using methadone, but when that attempt failed, they travelled to hospital to seek treatment, and police quickly traced them there. The two men were carrying a rucksack, and inside, officers made another grim discovery. They found body parts taken from both of the victims: an ear, the tip of a nose, and flesh from both victims. Searches of the flat uncovered even more evidence, including blood-stained weapons, hammers, machetes, Stanley knives, a blowtorch, cable ties, duct tape, and nails. As investigators dug into Ian MacLeod's past, they also uncovered a long history of violence. His former wife described a savage attack in which Ian beat her unconscious. When she eventually regained consciousness and staggered out into the street, neighbours found her covered in blood with a broken eye socket and severe facial injuries. For that attack, Ian was sentenced to 6 years in prison. In victim impact statements, Derek Johnston was remembered as a caring and compassionate man who loved animals and nature. Desmond Rawlings was described as a devoted father of 2, a loving partner, and a hard-working man despite suffering from significant back pain. Faced with overwhelming evidence against them, both Ian and Dean MacLeod pleaded guilty. During sentencing, the judge described them as monsters. He said that they had carried out an evil and premeditated killing spree laced with sadism, adding that they had killed and killed again simply out of bloodlust. Both men were sentenced to life imprisonment with minimum terms of 34 years. But then, less than a year after being jailed, Dean died in prison at the age of 43. Ian MacLeod remains behind bars for one of the most disturbing double murders in modern Scottish criminal history. This next inmate fled the country after severed human body parts were discovered in Loch Lomond. This is the case of William Beggs. William Beggs would later become known as the Limbs in the Loch Killer, one of Scotland's most notorious murderers. The case began on the 5th of December 1999 when 18-year-old Barry Wallace disappeared after a works Christmas party in Kilmarnock. Barry was a shelf stacker with plans to join the Royal Navy. After leaving the party, he made his way to a local nightclub and was last seen around 1:30 in the morning near the entrance. The following day, an organised training exercise was taking place at Loch Lomond when a horrifying discovery was made. Severed human body parts had been stuffed into bin bags and dumped in the water. The area was immediately sealed off as police launched a major investigation. Over the following days, even more body parts were discovered on the 7th, 8th and the 10th of December. But despite the extensive searches, investigators were still missing 2 crucial pieces of evidence: the victim's head and torso. Then, on the 15th of December, a human head was washed up on Barassi Beach in Ayrshire. The torso would also later be recovered from Loch Lomond. DNA testing confirmed that these remains belonged to Barry Wallace. The post-mortem examination revealed evidence that Barry had been subjected to a violent ordeal before his death. He had bruising and fractures to his face, evidence of a brutal sexual assault, marks on his wrists and ankles consistent with restraints, and a puncture wound on his arm that appeared to have been caused by a needle. Due to the condition of the remains, pathologists were unable to determine an exact cause of death. As investigators pieced together Barry's final movements, their attention quickly turned to a 36-year-old man named William Beggs. But when officers arrived at his home, they discovered that he was already gone. William had fled to the Netherlands. This presented a major problem for investigators, as extraditing suspects from Amsterdam could often be a lengthy and complicated process. While William remained overseas, police searched his flat, and what they found would become a key part of his prosecution. Forensic testing revealed traces of Barry Wallace's blood inside the washing machine and between the blade and the handle of a knife. Prosecutors later alleged that William had encountered Barry shortly after finishing a shift at a call centre. Barry was heavily intoxicated, and the court heard that William had offered him a lift. Instead of taking him home, though, prosecutors said that William then took the teenager back to his own flat, where he was sexually assaulted, murdered, and later dismembered. As the evidence mounted, William eventually handed himself into authorities in Amsterdam, but he didn't do so alone. He arrived with an extradition lawyer and fought attempts to return him to Scotland. The legal battle lasted for around a year before he was finally brought back to face trial. In October 2001, William Beggs was found guilty of the murder of Barry Wallace. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. But this wasn't his first murder charge. Years earlier, in 1987, he had been convicted of murdering a young man in England named Barry Oldham and wounding 2 others. Barry Oldham's body had been discovered on the North Yorkshire moors, and there had been evidence that attempts had been made to remove his arms and legs. William maintained that he acted in self-defence, but the twist is that his murder conviction was later quashed on appeal due to legal issues surrounding how evidence had been presented to the jury. He then moved to Scotland, where his violent behaviour continued. In July 1991, he invited a man named Brian McQuillan back to his flat in Kilmarnock. Once there, William attacked him with a razor. Brian only survived by jumping naked from the first-floor window and escaping. William was sentenced to 6 years in prison for the assault. His minimum term for the murder of Barry Wallace expired in 2019, making him eligible to apply for release. However, the parole board refused to free him in both 2020 and 2024, concluding that he continued to pose a risk to the public. This next inmate took a 16-year-old to her sister's burned body and told her if she said anything, that she would be next. This is the case of Robert Bayne. This case began in Wishaw in North Lanarkshire on the 23rd of May 2010. That morning, a motorcyclist spotted what he initially believed was a burnt-out tailor's mannequin lying in a woodland known locally as Monkey Hill. But as he got closer, he made a devastating discovery. What he had thought was a mannequin was actually a human body. The body had been extensively burned, with a heavy-duty plastic sheet covering the victim's face. Witnesses would later tell police that they had seen a fire burning in the area the previous night. The following day, Marion Nelson reported her 17-year-old daughter, Zoe Nelson, as missing. Zoe was a bright young woman studying motor vehicle repair with her whole life ahead of her. As officers began investigating, they learned that Zoe had last been seen on the evening of the 22nd of May following an argument with her 16-year-old sister, Laura Ann. This dispute centred around one man, 21-year-old bodybuilder Robert Bayne. Both sisters had been romantically involved with him. After their mum broke up the argument, Zoe left the house with Robert, who witnesses later recalled was drinking directly from a tequila bottle. As police appealed for information, several witnesses came forward. One reported seeing a heavily intoxicated man being violent towards Zoe. Another recalled seeing her with a man who had distinctive facial tattoos. And perhaps most chillingly, one witness described seeing a man matching Robert's description, punching a lamppost and shouting that he was going to kill someone that night. Another witness reported seeing Zoe inside an Asda store shortly before she disappeared, and CCTV later confirmed this sighting. The footage showed Zoe accompanied by a man carrying a distinctive tequila bottle fitted with a red plastic Mexican sombrero lid. Just 15 feet from Zoe's body, officers recovered the same tequila bottle and red sombrero lid. Testing later revealed a mixture of both Zoe's and Robert Bayne's DNA. Although the extent of the burns made it impossible to establish a definitive cause of death, pathologists believed that Zoe had most likely died from suffocation. The plastic sheet covering her face had partially melted during the fire. They also found evidence that she had suffered a violent assault before her death, including 2 black eyes, bruising inside her lip, and bleeding within her skull. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence came from Zoe's younger sister. The morning after Zoe vanished, Laura Ann went to Robert's home to return some of his clothes. According to her evidence, Robert appeared nervous, jumpy, and was drinking vodka. He then told her that he had something to show her. Robert then led the 16-year-old to Monkey Hill. There, he showed her the burned body of her own sister. Laura Ann later said that she only recognised Zoe because of a distinctive Rangers Football Club tattoo. He told her that if she told anyone what she had seen, that she would be next. Laura Ann kept this information quiet for 5 agonising days. Because he felt he had silenced Laura Ann, Robert grew increasingly confident. He washed and disposed of the clothes that he had been wearing and disposed of Zoe's phone. He believed that he had committed the perfect crime. With this growing arrogance, on the 28th of May, Robert walked into a police station claiming that he knew who had killed Zoe Nelson. He then provided officers with the name of another man. But this didn't work. Robert himself was arrested for murder. The court also heard that Robert had only been released from prison just 7 weeks before Zoe's murder, after serving an 18-month sentence for assault and robbery. Throughout proceedings, he showed very little remorse, and he never offered any explanation for why he killed Zoe. In the end, the jury found Robert Bayne guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, and even then, his outbursts continued. As the guilty verdict was read out in court, Robert became enraged in the dock, shouting abuse at Zoe's family before headbutting a security officer. More than a decade later, Zoe Nelson's family are still without answers as to why the bright 17-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her was murdered. This next inmate stole thousands of pounds from a retired teacher, lured him to a flat through a fake dating profile, then hid his body under a bed while police searched the property. This is the case of Paul McNaughton. The victim was 75-year-old Peter Tobin, a retired biology teacher. Peter had spent 3 decades teaching at Fettes College in Edinburgh. Friends described him as a gentle and cultured man who continued to enjoy life despite being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 5 years earlier. Peter first met Paul McNaughton through the dating website Gaydar. According to court, Peter had offered Paul money in exchange for sexual favours. After gaining Peter's trust, Paul obtained access to his bank details after memorising the details that were written down beside Peter's computer. Over time, he began transferring money into his own account. The thefts continued for years. The court heard that Paul took thousands from Peter, including 5,000 to buy a car and another 8,000 before going on holiday to Blackpool. Eventually, Peter discovered the missing money. According to evidence heard in court, he told Paul that he would have to continue providing sexual favours for the next year to repay what he had stolen. Rather than face the consequences of his actions, prosecutors said that Paul decided Peter had become a problem that needed to be removed. At the time, Paul was living with a 65-year-old man named Paul Black in a property on Seafield Road in Leith. I'll refer to Paul Black as just Black to avoid confusion. The court heard that Paul had moved in with Black after struggling to find accommodation that would accept both his cat and dog, so instead he slept on a sofa bed in the living room. Together, the pair continued exploiting Peter financially. Using a fake profile on Gaydar, featuring a photograph of a different man, messages were sent to Peter encouraging him to visit their property. Unaware of who he was actually talking to or what was waiting for him, Peter agreed. On the 11th of August 2022, Peter took a taxi to the address. The driver later recalled watching Peter walk inside before he drove away. This was the last confirmed sighting of Peter alive. Prosecutors believed Peter was attacked almost immediately after entering the flat. During the trial, Paul attempted to place most of the blame on Black. He claimed that Black had placed a bag over Peter's head and sat on him, while he simply sat on the sofa drinking Jack Daniels and smoking a joint. He also claimed that the pair went for a walk afterwards, but the jury rejected that account, concluding that Paul was attempting to minimise his own involvement. Paul claimed that both men had discussed suffocating Peter using a carrier bag. The court also heard that Black suffered from various health issues, and his defence argued that he was heavily influenced by Paul and had become so infatuated with him to the point where he would do almost anything that he asked. What happened after Peter's death was described in court as particularly disturbing. Paul had exploited Peter while he was alive, then continued exploiting him after death. In what prosecutors described as a cold, calm and chilling manner, Paul immediately travelled to Peter's home and took his bank cards. Over the following days, he helped himself to even more of Peter's money. Bank records and CCTV later showed him spending freely, booking a foreign holiday, and making various purchases, including 2 spades. Meanwhile, Peter's family had become increasingly worried. The day after he disappeared, concern was raised when unusual text messages began arriving from Peter's phone. The wording just didn't sound like him. Family members quickly realised that something was wrong and reported Peter missing. As police searched for answers, officers carried out searches at Paul and Black's flat, the home that the taxi driver recalled last seeing Peter enter. Despite searching the property, they found nothing suspicious. But what they didn't realise at the time was that Peter's body was hidden beneath the bed all along. Upon questioning, Paul even denied ever knowing Peter at all. Days later, the two stuffed Peter's body inside a turquoise suitcase and transported it to Northumberland. The original plan had been to bury him, which would explain the purchase of the spades. But after failing to dig a grave, they abandoned this idea. Instead, Peter's body was dumped beside a wall near the A696 between Otterburn and Belsay, where it remained for weeks. Then, on the 4th of September 2022, a police officer spotted a turquoise suitcase lying beside the road. Inside was the body of 75-year-old Peter Tobin. The level of decomposition meant that pathologists were unable to establish a definitive cause of death, and his identity had to be confirmed through dental records. Faced with the evidence against him, Paul McNaughton eventually pleaded guilty to murder. Paul Black denied murder, along with a number of other charges. The jury ultimately cleared Black of murder, but convicted him of perverting the course of justice. Paul Black was sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge concluded that Black had become so infatuated with Paul that he was willing to do almost anything for him. As for Paul McNaughton, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. This final inmate spent years convincing police that he was only a sex offender. Then, after a young woman's body was discovered beneath church floorboards, investigators uncovered a trail of murders stretching back more than 15 years. This is the case of Peter Tobin. For years, Peter Tobin was known as a violent sexual offender. What police didn't realise was that some of his more serious crimes had already been committed long before he was ever identified as a killer. In 1994, Tobin was sentenced to 14 years in prison for a brutal attack on two 14-year-old girls at his flat in Hampshire. The girls were forced to take drugs at knife point before being raped. Tobin was 47 years old at the time. He ultimately served around 10 years before being released in 2004 and placed on the sex offenders register. At that point, authorities believed they were dealing with a dangerous sex offender, but they had no idea that he was something far worse. Following his release, Tobin moved to Paisley in Scotland, and while here, police lost track of him. By 2006, he was living under the name of Pat McLaughlin, posing as a homeless handyman at St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow. It was there that he met 23-year-old Polish student Angelika Kluk. Angelika also lived and worked at the church. Friends described her as bright, highly responsible, and a joyful young woman. In September 2006, she suddenly disappeared. Days later, police made a horrifying discovery. Angelika's body had been hidden beneath the church floorboards, and the investigation revealed that she had suffered a prolonged and brutal attack. She had been repeatedly beaten over the head, raped, restrained, gagged, and then stabbed 16 times. Evidence also showed that she was actually still alive when she was placed beneath the floorboards. The brutality of the murder immediately raised alarm bells among detectives. This did not look like the actions of someone committing their first murder. Meanwhile, Tobin had fled to London, but he left behind blood-stained jeans containing his DNA, evidence that quickly identified him as the prime suspect. With this, authorities issued a nationwide warning about Tobin, stating that he may be a murderer. Then came the breakthrough. In 2006, a nurse working at a London hospital recognised Tobin from media appeals after he had admitted himself under yet another false identity, this time using the name James Kelly. He was arrested and returned to Scotland. As investigators dug deeper into his background, they discovered that Tobin had spent years moving around the country under various aliases. He had also used at least 38 different mobile phone SIM cards while travelling extensively throughout the United Kingdom. The more detectives learned about him, the more convinced they became that Angelika Kluk was not his first victim. Every police force in the country was alerted. Unsolved disappearances were re-examined, and before long, one particular case caught investigators' attention. 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton had vanished in February 1991 while waiting for a bus in Bathgate. Vicky loved music and dancing and had simply disappeared without a trace. Investigators soon discovered that Peter Tobin had been living in the Bathgate area at the time that she had vanished. In 2007, police searched his former home on Robertson Drive, and there, inside the loft, they found a dagger-like knife. On that knife was a tiny fragment of skin belonging to Vicky Hamilton. But there was more. Years earlier, Vicky's purse just mysteriously appeared at a bus stop. Recent DNA testing later revealed traces belonging to Tobin's son, who had only been a toddler at the time. Although Vicky's body had never been found, investigators now had enough evidence to charge Tobin with murder. At the same time, Essex police were investigating another disappearance. 18-year-old Dinah McNichol had vanished in August 1991 after attending a music festival. She and a friend had hitchhiked home, but after her friend left the vehicle, Dinah continued her journey alone. She was never seen again. Police discovered that Tobin had also been living in that area at the same time. Investigators searched a former property of his again, this time on Irvine Drive in Margate. Using ground-penetrating radar, forensic archaeologists detected unusual disturbances beneath the garden. When they began digging, they found a body. The remains had been cut in two, wrapped in layers of bin bag and cloth, and concealed beneath the ground. Investigators initially believed that they had found the body of Dinah McNichol, but instead, they made a shocking discovery. The body belonged to Vicky Hamilton. At some point after leaving Bathgate, Tobin had transported Vicky's body hundreds of miles and buried her in his back garden. Then, just 4 days later, and only meters away, investigators found another body. This time, it was Dinah. She had been bound, gagged, wrapped in 16 heavy-duty bin bags, and buried beneath concrete. As the investigation continued, a disturbing picture of Tobin's life also emerged. Former partners described years of violence and abuse. His first wife said that he frequently beat her and kept her locked up. One neighbour reportedly contacted authorities after seeing her blood dripping through the ceiling. She had also returned home one day to find that Tobin had decapitated her puppy. His second marriage was just as violent and eventually ended when his wife fled to a women's refuge. For the murder of Angelica Kluck, Peter Tobin received a life sentence with a minimum term of 21 years. For the murder of Vicky Hamilton, he received a 30-year sentence. Then, for the murder of Dinah McNichol, he was handed a third life sentence in the form of a whole life order, ensuring that he would never be released. Even then, questions still remained. While in prison, Tobin reportedly boasted that he had killed 48 women. Investigators also examined links to around 15 unsolved cases, and many believed that the true number of his victims may never be known. 7 other women were later identified as having been raped by Tobin. On the 8th of October 2022, Peter Tobin died at HMP Edinburgh at the age of 76. He took with him the answers to many questions that investigators had spent years trying to solve.